Thank you, everyone, for joining me for this next session, which is going to focus on how we build resilience in a world of escalating digital threats. The pandemic has fueled a huge cybercrime wave, big rise in cyber attacks on our most critical services and businesses. And indeed, many of us may have woken up today to the news that emerged overnight, confirmed by the UK government, of the scale of Russia's planned cyber hacking of the Tokyo Olympics, an investigation that was carried out by US and UK cybersecurity services. So with that, with the US election in sight, this session is going to look at how we protect our democratic institutions and governments and counter these threats. Now, this session will also include 10 minutes of your questions. So for our audience online, you can submit them using the platform as we mentioned earlier. And for those who are here with us in the hangar, if you could write your questions and submit them on the cards to the help desk. And as many of them as possible will be put to me to pass on to our panelists. So without further delay, let me welcome them. First, I'm joined here on HMS Queen Elizabeth by Mike Beck, the Global Chief Information Security Officer at the British AI cybersecurity company Darktrace. I'm also joined here on stage by Richard Meredith, the Deputy Chairman of Digitalis, a digital risk and online reputation firm. He's also spent 28 years in the British Diplomatic Service, focusing on national security with appointments in the Cabinet Office and the Treasury. And joining us from Maryland today, I'm delighted to welcome Vice Admiral Myers, Commander at Fleet Cyber Command, an organisation responsible for Navy information network operations and offensive and defensive cyberspace operations. And finally, we're joined from London by Dr. Deborah Peterson, who's the Deputy Director at the UK's National Cybersecurity Centre, responsible for private sector critical national infrastructure, including energy, water, transport and telecoms. Welcome to all of you. I'll start with Dr. Peterson first. So in this new world of ever-rising cyber threats, how do we ensure our institutions and our critical infrastructure can be protected?
Thanks, Samira. For me, the first thing it's really important for us to understand is what's important to our critical national infrastructure. It sounds extraordinary, but what we find is many of our industries is they're very good at things, what I'd say you put bollards around that you can see, so everyone knows. For example, Heathrow is really important as an asset. But what we find is the mapping of that logical infrastructure that connects it all is not always as well as understood. So industries don't always understand sort of the crown jewels at protecting the most critical parts of their infrastructure. So for us in the UK, what we've been doing is mapping that digital infrastructure that has enabled us through the pandemic to keep working, but also can bring enormous risk. And through that mapping, we're able to see where telecoms, energy, finance, where they all interact and how they depend upon one another. And then having a really true partnership with industry. So in the NCSC, we're building something called the Cyber Defence Ecosystem, where we're looking to share threat information at machine speeds, early warning systems to get indicators of compromise out there. And what we've driven through the pandemic is it's sort of driven a change in our behaviour in protective security, where we've developed new tradecraft because where we have wrapped ourselves around the national health system and around vaccines, and as you mentioned already, there's been Russian activity that we've attributed in those sectors. We've developed pioneering tradecraft looking at the threat to our infrastructure, whereas I think traditionally we've always looked at the threat from hostile states and our adversaries, where we've had to sort of innovate in order to sort of further develop that protective security and wrap that around our most critical systems, with the aiming of basically making it too expensive for our adversaries. Effectively, they have to use up their equities, use their A teams, and that's our ambition. So the government, it has developed things like active cyber defence to try and take sort of the worst harms and the most common harms away from our public sector, and looking to move that to private sector, taking down, working with the internet service providers. You may have seen reference to our suspicious email reporting, where the general public have reported almost 3 million scam emails, and then led us to take down tens of thousands of sites that we didn't know about previously. And like today, attributing, where we know often military units are attacking our industries. So what we find is our day-to-day defence of the homeland is being done by commercial enterprises, our energy companies, our transport companies. And so it's that really deep partnership, not us giving advice and hoping people take it, the working day in, day out with industry and getting information that used to be classified top secret only a couple of years ago out to industry so they can take action in real time.
And I wondered, Vice Admiral Myers, if you could give us the kind of American military perspective on the nature of the threat and what you're doing, particularly in the light of the latest revelations about Russia and the Tokyo Olympics. It was really striking that this is essentially a kind of military strike, isn't it?
Samira, thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon. But first, if I can, I'd like to extend my thanks to the First Sea Lord for inviting me to participate in this one, but I did notice that he invited me to participate virtually as an aviator. He didn't invite me to come and sail with him on the Queen Elizabeth or fly the Joint Strike Fighter. So I appreciate being here and being with you as well. So this morning, absolutely. So Fleet Cyber and all of the Department of Defense and other cyber organizations underneath the Department of Defense are having to relook at how COVID-19 has presented different challenges. It has increased our telework capacity by necessity. We've had to increase our footprint to telework, and by doing so, it also increased our footprint and vulnerability. With this, we've also had to realize that we have to, in the cyber arena, learn how to fight hurt, just as you do in shipboard integrity, just as you do at sea, just as you do in your aircraft. You aren't going to have 100%. You're going to have to find resiliency, and you're going to have to learn to fight when you don't have all the systems available to you. And so, Mary, it's interesting that you brought up Russia and how they admitted, at least it was in the press, that they wanted to go ahead and have an impact on the Olympics, the 2020 Olympics in Tokyo. We are committed through our parent command, U.S. Cyber Command, and the number one mission right now is election security. I know that we've worked with the Brits in their election. They're helping with our election as well, but the election security is mission number one. And this isn't the first year that the Russians have tried to influence, and they are pulling out more stops. They're pulling out more effort because they absolutely want to influence. But we were successful in 2018. We're a little bit surprised in 2016 by their efforts, but it is no surprise. It's no surprise either that the Russians have ulterior motives, and they are truly the adversary in the cyberspace, as admitted in the press today.
Thank you so much, Vice Admiral Myers. On the stage with me, I wanted to ask both Richard first and then Mike. So clearly the pandemic has speeded up the way that many more people are working remotely and potentially expanded the kind of landscape in which cyber attacks can take place. I wonder what both your takes are on how dramatically the nature of the threats has changed, and looking ahead, what you think we should be prioritising. I don't know if you want to go first, Richard.
Well, taking it from the sort of point of view of disinformation, I think we're not really talking here necessarily about a threat that is hardware or software based. We're talking about a threat that emerges out of a playbook that one might say, Vladimir Lenin came up with 100 years ago in terms of trying to shape perceptions, instill uncertainty and mistrust in institutions through information, through the parlaying of half facts and untruths into the public discourse. I think the opportunity that the COVID-19 pandemic has presented to adversaries is a self-evident one, in that it is in a time of increasing uncertainty, increasing doubts around institutions and authority, inevitable given the stresses that societies are under. The opportunities here to twist that knife, to add some flame to some fuel to the flame, is delivering strategic objectives that are quite clearly in the interests of our adversaries to pursue. We are trying to protect, and I think Mark Sedwill made the point earlier, unity and coherence of our societies. We do it against threats to the quality of our political discourse. I mean, one doesn't want to over-exaggerate that, but certainly the last 4 or 5 years, I think on both sides of the Atlantic, there has been a sense that the quality of our political discourse has changed. I think one goes back to Lyndon Johnson and wonders, that lies weren't invented in the last 5 years. They're a part of a muscular and robust political debate in all our societies. But the quality of that political discourse, I think, has become frayed a little bit. And of course, societies under pressure, economic, social, feeling vulnerable to these things. So we see in COVID really interesting opportunities by presumably the Russians, but perhaps others, to generate concern over vaccines. The whole anti-vax movement, big in the US, growing here, promoting that, using social media to amplify it. None of this requires hacking. It can require abusing the terms of the terms of use of the social media companies, the platforms they use. But this is around amplifying these false narratives and generating political and social uncertainty. I was interested the other day again in the Times around the allegations of Russian activity around the monkey vaccine. The narrative of the monkey vaccine, particularly potent in the developing world, that this is something invented by Bill Gates on the one hand, I think is often alleged, but its distribution is something that they're trying to discourage. Of course, the point about that, I think, was interesting. The Times, the 22,000 people that clicked on the monkey vaccine story in the UK was infinitely magnified by the number of people that read it on the front page of the Times. So there is a sense in which we are, as societies, are amplifying this sense of uncertainty by making stories of it ourselves. And I don't know where the issue is not to discourage the Times from reporting, but we do a sense of a responsibility to make sure that there is a better understanding of how these techniques are being deployed.
Interesting. So if we move the conversation on then to talk about possible solutions, Mike Beck, everyone knows that private companies are part of the solution of tackling cybercrime. And yet we also know there is great anxiety, I think it's fair to say, in the general public at large about the nature of that role and how far private companies can be part of the problem. What's your take on solutions for the nature of the cyber threats that we face?
Yeah, I think the first thing I'd say, I'd probably come back to the COVID point and where that's taken us in a kind of digital world. So I think we can see globally the kind of resilience that we're seeing from global business. They're moving to a remote workforce. They're adopting cloud at a pace that has never before been seen. The digital transformation that we're seeing inside business is incredible, and they're doing that to make themselves resilient, to make themselves operational, and to make sure that they can, carry on doing what they're doing. I think, in answer to your question in terms of where can private sector kind of come into play there, it has to be through the investment and advancement in technologies. So some of those were said by Lord Sedwell at the start in terms of things like AI, things like advancing our scientific research into places where we need to go to move the needle on what technology can do to support those industries. So I think, I would come back to say that there's a lot of complexity out there in the world in terms of how they're delivering technology, but there has to be investment from private companies. I think, one of the places we'll probably go in this discussion later on, perhaps, but is in terms of the big technology providers.
Well, say it now. What would you like to say about them?
Well, I think they're in a very interesting place, right? I think they dominate a global social media platform. They are technology providers that are intertwined in ways that...
Are you talking about regulation? Because that's what a lot of people are asking. Should there be more government regulation of some of these big tech providers? When you look at the effect of Facebook in countries like Myanmar, in India, where they're linked to unrest, that's sort of at the heart of what you're hinting at, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's there's a massively, there's a huge debate there, right? And I think the thing I would say is that they have a responsibility in themselves in how they're operating, and I can see it day in, day out in terms of how those big technology providers, the Microsoft, the Amazons. Even if we just think about cloud today, Microsoft and Amazon are dominating that kind of Western footprint in terms of how cloud's being adopted.
Let me bring in Vice Admiral Myers and Dr. Patterson again on this, because operating in cyberspace is clearly different from other warfighting domains. The growing security industry affects military operations as well. Vice Admiral Myers first, what's your take, partly responding to what Mike Beck said about the challenge for dealing with corporations in solving the military threat in a way?
No, I absolutely agree with Mr. Beck, but the perspective that I share from, and it's true in the business world as well, but in the military, we are more and more reliant upon the validity and the sanctity of the data. And if the data is corrupted, then it corrupts your weapon systems, et cetera. So keeping the integrity is first and foremost on the data. We also know that we have to share the information. How, and to your question to Mr. Beck is, okay, how do you get after it? And we, the Western world, have abdicated our responsibility in the internet because we did not set the internationally accepted norms. So it's harder to get it established now. We're behind the eight ball as what is allowable, what is accepted as far as normal behavior. But in getting after the threat, we have found, and we absolutely have seen, that we have to share the information. We have found that working with allies and partners, both in industry and in the military, that it's key and essential that you share the information, both good and bad, what your weaknesses are with your allies and partners, to show that where you need help to shore up your defenses. So we have found that by sharing that information, it actually makes the collective partnership stronger.
Dr. Patterson, what are your thoughts on this? You already referred to examples of how the public were helping, but it's interesting that so much of what enemy action is, if you can call it that, is operating below the threshold of armed conflict, stealing intellectual property, leveraging personally identifiable information.
I think it's a new space for government to be thinking in terms of what encompasses national security. So at the moment, the global pandemic has obviously led to some pretty adverse economic situation, and suddenly economic espionage and commercial espionage can be as part as much as recovery in terms of thinking about your national security, whereas traditionally we've thought about it in terms of disruptive attack. But also, I think in terms of cyber warfare, what you're seeing is norms changing. So, for example, in the Middle East, we've seen kinetic responses to cyber attacks, and not just, it used to be sort of tit for tat. If there's a cyber attack here, there's a cyber attack there. But now we're seeing a kinetic response to a cyber attack, or a cyber attack in response to a kinetic attack. So it's getting far more blended. And then what you're seeing is that gets into the wild, and things that were never targeted at the West sort of reaching over there. I think our petrochemical and our chemical sector have been hit by attacks that were never targeted at us, because our adversaries don't work with the same pinpoint precision a Western government might. In terms of their risk appetite is much higher. So I mentioned, like, the GRU's been mentioned today, have been attributed in terms of their activity. That's a military unit, but they are targeting non-military institutions. So I think what you're seeing is this blending. And going back to what Mike Beck was saying, is in terms of supply chain, is I think we need to have a much clearer expectation with industry. So I'm thinking, sorry, a bit technical here, but there was a vulnerability release with a company called Trek, which is sort of a component part within the Internet of Things. They reckon it's in hundreds of millions of devices over the past 20 years. So industry might not even know they have that in their technology stack. So it's us helping how you deal with these extremely complex situations and working with industry to come up with these solutions.
Mike, do you want to respond to that? It's quite interesting, the idea that companies might also need help to identify their vulnerabilities. And then we've got some questions to take from the audience. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, I think, I fully agree with that position, right? There is so much technology out there today. Companies are consuming it at a huge rate. They're using Internet of Things to gain business advantage. There will be things being plugged into, everything from paint workshops through to production floors, through to SCADA systems, through to fish tanks, and it's all that kind of range of technology. that exists today that hackers are going to try and get through. And there's something around this in terms of how do we as leaders recognize that there is a cyber threat out there. And when we're thinking about managing risk, about what our business does, about what we do, what we deliver, we have to accept that from a leadership perspective, cyber attackers around us, and whether it's coming from nation-state actors, whether it's coming from criminals, the level of cyber criminal activity, hitting us today globally, ransomware gets all of the headlines, but it's phenomenal. It's out there, and it's a huge risk to our operational picture.
And Richard, one thing I wanted to sneak in, because you raised the issue of concern about security ahead of elections. If you had a little list of the key actions you think governments need to take and need to be thinking about to protect the resilience of these kinds of institutions and events, would you be able to say what they are?
I think it's difficult. There was an interesting Hugo Rifkind article, I think, in today's Times, yesterday's Times, raising the issue, but again raising no solutions. I suspect that post the US election, the curtailing of the powers of social media platforms is one of those few consensus issues on which both sides of the American political divide probably share a view. And I suspect that next 10 years will be seeking that solution. I don't think it's an easy one. The business model is fundamentally against it. But I do think that there is a sufficient concern around the world of the influence that these organizations can have, exploited by our foreign adversaries to destabilize trust in our institutions and trust in the results of our democratic process. Everybody, I think, understands that, and I hope there is a work programme post-November in which that is resolved. There are no easy solutions, but it has to be done.
Thank you. Right, so a question that's coming from the audience. In terms of deterrence within the cyber defence arena, what do you regard as the most important element? Is it our ability to hit back, or being resilient enough to not be attacked, or what? I'm going to ask Vice Admiral Myers this first.
Well, that's a great question, and I don't think it's the resiliency to not be attacked. You're going to be attacked. As Mr. Beck's already said there, little Timmy outside the fence line with a $500 computer off the shelf connected to the internet can be a cyber threat with the criminals and then state actors as well. So to me, it is the resiliency, and through the resiliency, you will find deterrence. But you're not going to stop cyber attacks. You've got to be able to fight your way through it.
Okay. This is a question for Dr. Petterson. State cyber actors are often militarised cyber arms. How does the NCSC envisage supporting industry in actioning threat intelligence that may originate from sophisticated state actors?
So I mentioned a couple. So there's been a real shift in the last 3.5 years since we were stood up, and the whole aim was to take an entirely new approach to protective security and to get that intelligence from top secret and out to actionable intelligence with industry. The main complaint was we knew lots of stuff, but we got it to them too late and too little information to act. And so we've listened hard to that. So first, it's working with our partners like the US. And in fact, there was a fantastic outcome, I think it was last year, where one of the ATM cash out attacks, our partners were able to get that information to us really quickly, and we were able to take preemptive action in the UK and get our industry that information out so fast via the regulator. So actually one point I wanted to make that, again, going back to Mike's point, is I think our most powerful activity. So we're NCSC, but we're part of GCHQ, and for over 20 years we've had partnerships with industry. But the new cyber regulation in the UK, working with the regulators in that kind of instance, has been really, really good, because, for example, our Financial Conduct Authority has a relationship with 67 or 72,000 firms. So when intelligence like this comes out, being able to get it out to that many firms at speed from someone they'll listen to has been critical. So it's getting those indicators of compromise. And I mentioned our cyber defense ecosystem, where we're getting companies to line up with us and their security incident and event management systems, so we can start sharing information at machine speed and just making sure we can declassify that information as fast as possible. Because as I mentioned before, what we want is our adversaries to find it hard, expensive, and use up their equity to attack us. And so that's our ambition. So regulate our new regulation to drive up cyber hygiene, so it's not that low-hanging fruit that your script kiddie can attack a firm, and make it hard and expensive, and then have resilient firms that when they are attacked, they know how to respond and recover quickly.
Thank you. And Mike, can I ask you to respond then, sort of flipping the question from the industry point of view? Do you feel overall that the partnership with government is working well, or are there things you'd like to see done differently?
Yeah, I think certainly I came from a background inside GCHQ, so I know exactly where Dr. Peterson's coming from, and seeing what the NCSC is today, delivering, top secret intelligence out into the world, out into businesses to help them defend. I think it's absolutely fantastic space to be in, and it's taken us to a place where we could never have imagined 5 years ago. I think probably just going back to one of the original questions that you asked at the start. I think resilience is really important inside businesses, and having the state kind of move that resilience along and working with people to develop that. I do think there's a space for the state to fight back more. I think there is part of that that comes from the knowledge that is from the government, that they can do more to fight those attackers and protect us.
I'm going to try and get in two more questions. So this is a great one. There is a lot of talk of Russian disinformation. Are we in danger of overlooking the threat from other states? Who would like to take that? Richard, you're smiling.
The Russian disinformation I think it's evident to us because, of course, it's a sort of bizarre part of their playbook that exposure of covert operations is quite often in their interests. They need to know that we know that they are able to do this. Remaining entirely secret and us not knowing about it would essentially defeat the point. So I think that there is a sense in which we have focused on that. But I do think they will go straight through the front door with a blunderbuss in a way that perhaps other states might be more sophisticated in their disinformation campaigns. But I do think that Russia's, I want to say, resilience to public opprobrium on these issues over the last half-decade has been extraordinary, and the criticisms they face and their unwillingness to change their modus operandi. So I do think they still pose a greater threat. China moving up on the inside, showing those capabilities, but I don't think quite operating it with that same flagrant nature that the Russians seem to be doing.
Well, thank you for explaining that reasoning so well. Vice Admiral Myers, your views on threats beyond Russia?
Absolutely agree with Mr. Meredith and Dr. Peterson on that one, but rest assured, Russia's not the only one, and being able to share classified information quickly and being able to get it out to industry to minimize the risk and the impact for the resiliency of the network. But yes, we're quite aware Russia's not the only one, and yes, we are tracking all the other factors.
One more question, quite a specific one. According to a small British AI defence firm, Advi, Google searches on the term adversarial machine learning are 100 times greater in China than the UK and 50 times greater than the US. What happens when you are able to completely fool an AI system? Mike Beck, is this one for you to take first, and then maybe Deborah Peterson? I
think really interesting, right? We're heading into a world where artificial intelligence research domain has just kind of exploded. We're seeing all the benefits into our industry space, into cyber defense, because AI is very well placed where there is a lot of digital data. So, the fact that people are going to start to use AI in offensive ways isn't a massive leap forward, right? So it makes sense this is happening. I think we have to be prepared for a world where people are using offensive AI and it starts to become commoditized and things like that. In the future, that's just the space that we're going to land ourselves in.
Thank you. Dr. Peterson.
Yeah, I think, so with AI, you still need the smart minds behind it, but it's the speed at which the analysis can be done. But for me, in terms of the critical national infrastructure, there's something that at this point we need to be extremely proactive in the data-rich environments and ensuring that as we people don't blindly move into not thinking through how you secure those data-rich environments. The forefront of my mind, there's things like smart cities, where our citizens won't have the choice if they carry a mobile phone, whether they opt in or opt out. And therefore, there's something very much as a nation state that we need to think about our citizens in how we protect them and make sure there's not an unthinking move into this technology, and that we don't accidentally trip into a situation where our citizens' data isn't safe, because that's what the AI and the adversarial AI will depend upon.
Thank you so much. What I really liked about this session was a sense not only of the nature of the threat and the ease with which a disruption can be caused, but also an insight into the scale of cooperation and the work by government, by private firms and by our defence forces. So I'd like to thank all my panellists and thank you very much for your questions. Our next panel discussion will be focusing on hypersonics.